That's fine.
So thanks everybody for coming to this session. Oh, okay. We're getting feedback, but that's okay. It probably won't destabilize too badly. So Daz and I were having this conversation. We've had it a couple of times now, but we reiterated it yesterday. And so the thing that really strikes me about the connection between identity and big data is identity, used to be sort of a discrete, monolithic thing. It was maybe a name on a driver's license or a picture on a driver's license or something, and it sort of had to be presented, right? So, when I was 17 and wanted to buy beer legally, I had illegally, sorry, but apparently legally, I had to actually pull a thing out of my pocket and show it to someone, and there was no magnetic stripe on the back, and it really didn't leave a record or anything. So identifying myself was an act of will. It was a conscious act. I think if the revelations by Edward Snowden and the subsequent discussion of them have demonstrated anything, what they have demonstrated is that now, in a certain sense, we are displaying our identities at all times, but we sort of don't know it yet, or at least we're just starting to realize it. And it's almost like, like these moths that see in ultraviolet spectrum, right? So unless you have the special glasses that let you see into like the metadata universe, it's hard to tell that you're displaying your identity at all times in ways that we were not socialized to anticipate and behave properly in. So big data and big metadata and databases of things and sensors everywhere creates this ambient identification environment that we're not used to dealing with, and so I think this is really what the discussion today is going to be about. And so I'm grateful to Daza for hosting this, and Daza, if you would just say a few words and introduce Cam, maybe we can get the discussion started. And I do apologize, I'm going to have to step out. I have another thing that I have to get to in a minute.
You bet. And so I'm sorry, Bob, just because we can't see, how many folks are in the room, and who do we have?
We got about 12, 13 people in the room, and I'll have everyone go around and real quickly introduce themselves. So start here.
David Brogman, Association for Computing Machinery.
Craig Lee, the Aerospace Corporation.
Colin Wallace, DESA.
Peter Jezik, individual. Sam Madani, U.S. Cyber Institute.
Adam Maslin, Symantec.
Ryan Fox, IDME.
Hi, DESA. It's Mary Hoddard.
And Andrew Hughes.
And
Awesome.
Sudhi Marji here.
Oh,
and Sudhi is manning the console as if he were Captain Kirk.
Awesome. Great. And Sudhi, by the way, is an MIT graduate, and he runs some Trusted Federal, who's staffing this. Great. Thanks, Bob. We appreciate that very much. So, and hello, everybody. This session, really, the reason I called the Bird of a Feather session, and why Bob thought it was a good idea, is to have an opportunity to informally talk about big data and its relevance to the mission and the purpose of IDESG. So when we think of identity, typically in IDESG, the assumed definitions and contexts, even though we haven't fully even agreed on them yet, if you look at the range of scenarios that they reflect, none of them really adequately capture yet this new element of big data and how big data affects identity and privacy and fair information practices, which are really core to the NSTIC mission. It's what we're to be guided by. And the capabilities of, well, first of all, what big data is and the capabilities of this type of technology are not yet well understood. And yet they are clearly very relevant to the mission and to the playing field that IDESG is tasked to work in. And so it seemed like a good time to begin a dialogue, to talk about what is big data and what might some of those intersection points be. Just as some sense of validation, I guess, but also as a nexus for the dialogue, the White House is now in the midst of a major policy review, I guess would be one way to put it, on big data, and the President has tasked John Podesta to create a report with recommendations on, I'm just speaking very generally here, but generally with recommendations for the administration with respect to big data and our policy stance in the United States, generally. And so what this tells us is it's an important question. We don't have it's not a done deal. People are talking about what should our policy be because it is important. So to add some context to this, I have asked Cam Carey to join us because he was actually at, well, several reasons. Number one, if I may say, like a little bit about the context and background, Cam was most recently General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Commerce, of which NIST is a part, and is very familiar with the issues in the playing field that IDESG operates in. And also, he is very interested in big data. And so, among other hats, since he's left government service just a few months ago, he's now a researcher here at the Media Lab in Sandy Pentland's group, where I work as well. Sandy Pentland is the big data guy here in the Media Lab, and one of the key big data, I think, scientists in the world, frankly. And the reason Cam's here is partly to better get his mind around big data and the policy and legal implications, and he's doing really important, I think, he's asking some seminal questions and starting some great research. And so that's at a high level for asking relevant questions, and we're a very relevant person. But more tactically, I thought I'd be in California this week at the plenary, but also at a workshop that happened a couple of days ago at UC Berkeley, where the legal aspects of big data and privacy, I'm sure, came up, and there was a nice dialogue on that topic. And Cam was one of the invited presenters there, and that was a White House event that was co-hosted and convened and held at UC Berkeley, as I understand it. And that there were there's some workshops and a lot of discussions of people talking through these topics for a day beforehand, and Cam is just fresh off those dialogues, and so thought it would be, a great opportunity to get to share some perspective that's quite current and at a really high level, I think, of relevance for IDESG on what the topics are. So I'd like to really hand it over to Cam now to maybe say a few words about what big data is and maybe some of the policy issues that come up. And then I'd like to see if we can have a quite open dialogue so we can ask questions and just talk informally and see if we can start making some progress on where the intersections are and maybe future questions for IDESG perhaps, if we get that far. So with that, thank you very much for taking time to join us, Cam, and it's all yours.
All right. Well, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks. It's good to be with you. Right. This is I enjoy being involved with NSTIC from a different perspective, having at the Department of Commerce worked to establish it and to get Jeremy Grant on board, followed the progress. So let me talk a little bit about the big data review that's going on now. And some of the issues it may raise or may not raise for identity and for the NSTIC work. I guess on that the first question, sort of what is big data? There's not really any clear point of demarcation, but what the phenomenon involves and what the White House task force is looking at is that we have gone through sort of in the last few years a quantum change in the collection and analysis of data. And big data is really a reflection of the changes in the cost structure and result and technology of collecting data, of storing data, of analyzing data. So that now happens at quantities and at speeds that were really inconceivable not that long ago. And by the estimates of the companies that are storing the data or doing the analytics, the volume of data has increased has doubled over just the last 2 years. So that effectively, what the data that's been created in the last 3 years is equal to all of the information that's created since the beginning of time before that. And if you look at some of the charts on what the volume of data is going to involve, and the number of transactions that are going to take place online, it's a hockey stick right about now. So that poses some serious issues. The president, in response to the Snowden disclosure, said he wanted to have a national conversation about privacy. We have been having that. Much of it on surveillance issues. The president has had 2 boards that take a look at that, both the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and before that, the special review committee that he appointed, a trusted advisor, to look at the intelligence gathering and make some recommendations to the president as to what to do about it. The president in January gave an address, his response to some of the recommendations, and said then, among other things, that he thought that the Section 215 program, the most controversial part of the NSA surveillance that was collecting phone records in the United States and obtaining those in order to do searches for potential terrorist patients or to identify the network of contacts for involving foreign numbers, that he wants to terminate that program and have somebody else other than NSA retain the data. Last week announced he's going to go ahead with that. One of the other things he did as part of that speech was to initiate this broader policy review of big data, looking not just at the federal government, but more broadly. So that has been underway. John Podesta is leading it. Secretary of Commerce Pritzker, Secretary of Energy are involved as well. And that task force has had a very extensive process. They've met with a number of different stakeholders. I met with John Podesta, staff that are working on it, along with some of the other folks who were involved in developing the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights to talk about how that applies to big data. And they've had a request for public comment out. They have had a series of workshops, one here at MIT at the beginning of March, looking mostly at technology issues and some of the ways that people are using data for research in medicine, in urban planning, among other things, and focusing, I think, on some of the benefits of big data. And I think the clear message there is that there really is the opportunity to change social science research, that the volume of data that's available makes it possible to see patterns with a granularity that simply has never been possible before. It has a huge impact on a variety of social sciences or medical science. But also clearly a number of risks as well. They had another workshop a couple of weeks ago at NYU, and then concluded with this workshop at Berkeley that looked at sort of the values and sort of public policy issues involved in big data. I think as I look at the risks, and particularly in terms of the identity issue, and to pick up on what Bob said, I mean, one of the clear messages that comes out of the series of workshops on the Big Data Review is that is the significant risk of re-identification. So records data can be de-identified, used in that form for research, but there is a significant risk that the identified data can be correlated with other information and relatively easily identify specific individuals, even if the so-called personally identifiable information has been stripped out. So big data does change the identity. And one of the impacts, one of the risks of big data is certainly to increase the risk of de-identification. The more data becomes available to correlate with any given data set, it becomes easier to identify individuals in that data set. Now, there are certainly other risks that arise, particularly from big data, from the security standpoint. Now it also increases risks. It provides more sources of information for phishing attacks and other things. It gives data thieves a much richer set of targets. And clearly the breach risk is increased simply in terms of the magnitude of a loss. Any given breach much greater because the amount of data that is being stored. So those, I think, are some of the particular risks that relate to identity. I think the fundamental mission of establishing an ecosystem in which there are trusted identities certainly strongly persists through this. So that I think part of the challenge is how can one create identities that will allow trusted transactions, trusted transfers of data to occur in ways that will, when the data is in storage, will preserve the data, keep the anonymity. There are ways to strip out the identification in order to protect security. So the Podesta group is now has about 2 weeks to finish writing their results. So we'll hear soon their conclusions. Now, they're clearly not going to answer all of the questions there are about big data, but I think they'll be pointing the way to some future research, and I hope building on the work that we did to develop the White House blueprint on consumer privacy and consumer privacy Bill of Rights.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. So the very last phrase, by the way, just to amplify it, was the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, which is kind of the punchline, is how I look at it. I will add a link to that directly to the wiki for this session. We have a wiki page because it's worth looking at. It's got a substantial overlap with the mission of, and it came out some of the same motivations that from
no,
which
absolutely.
I mean,
all of both NSTIC and the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, the work that Commerce did on cybersecurity, are all about preserving trust in the online ecosystem.
Yeah. So with that, let's throw it open, wide open. Here's our big shot, like, to get our minds around what is big data. There's no stupid questions. There's no stupid statements. It's a birds of a feather session. It's on. So who's in the room there, by the way? Kim said she might be in the room and be willing to facilitate. Is Kim there?
No, she's not.
Nope.
No. Okay. Is there somebody that would be willing to help just to make sure that people that want to speak have an opportunity and to help facilitate in the room, please?
Yeah, I think we'll be able to handle that with Sudi on lines, and we all have eye contact in the room.
Great. Was that you, Andrew?
It's Andrew Hughes, yeah. Actually, if I could ask a question.
Can you please state your name before you just people know?
So it's Andrew Hughes. Okay, so let's imagine that we're in a jurisdiction that has very strong privacy rights for the individual. We know the technology these days just sheds data. So every move you make sheds information, packets, whatever, at an increasing rate, which of itself is not personal information. It's only when you profile it, only when you footprint it, only when you watch the patterns on a large scale, even in privacy-protected environments. So what can the individual?
Oh, okay.
But I guess I'm assuming that the risk to the individual, concern of the citizen is part of the discussion. So aside from the Privacy Bill of Rights, I mean or the Citizens Bill of Rights, what can we do about it? Because there's almost nothing that we can do to stop the information shedding from us, and there's little we can do to prevent the information being reassembled. Now, maybe we can have laws that prevent it from being used for purposes outside of our control. But what's the sense of the discussion around that inevitability of data?
Well, that's a big part of the big data discussion, and the discussion is sort of what are the policy implications, because clearly what you are talking about is going to happen increasingly as sensors deploy widely, not just GPS devices or accelerometers or other sensors, temperature sensors, in our cell phones or on some of the wearable devices, but smart cities applications, increasing surveillance tools. There's going to be a lot of data gathered that we do not have control over, and individual control has been an important component of the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights. And notice and choice have been sort of central to the existing system of privacy protection. One of the things that we did in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights was to say, we need to put more emphasis on other aspects of the fair information practice principles than just the notice of choice, because because of big data, and because really we're already in a situation where notice and choice isn't working. Because even if online, it would take people at least 100 hours a year to read all the privacy policies for sites that they use online. And so notice and choice effectively has been sort of devaluing privacy protection.
Right.
We need contextual notice that when it's really important, and we need things like focused collection, like transparency not just in terms of having a privacy policy that you can read, but much greater ability for consumers to understand how data is being used. And what the picture is that informs of them. And we need use limitations, particularly, and tight ones when it comes to the data that gets collected that we have no control. The sensor data, the surveillance cameras, all of those kinds of things, so that we understand it's for limited purposes, for limited periods.
So I think we got another question from the room. Are you just sitting close?
No, Daza, on your chat, I put a link to a blog post that I threw up on Tuesday during the big data workshop, quote unquote, at Berkeley on Tuesday. I wonder if you could throw it up on the left, because I kind of want to make a point about the diagram that's in there. Whoops, oh, sorry. I first copied in the big data. The White House comments on big data are due tomorrow, and that's the Federal Register link. Let me give you the link again to the blog post. But what I did is I made a diagram of different types of quote-unquote big data, because I think we really kind of screw up our discussion on this if we're not specific about different types of big data. So let me just grab that again.
We also screw up our discussion if we don't get the context right. There's a mile of difference between a law enforcement context and a user a user transaction context.
It's on my screen right here, Nava, in the chat. It's
big data ever go
directly to Nava?
It's directly
in
to
the
maybe.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm coming in, so avert your eyes from the video for a moment. It's going to get ugly, and please continue, Mary.
Sorry. Okay. So one point that I wanted to make, and I felt kind of frustrated during the Tuesday Big Data Day talking about this, was that everybody just lumps big data together and nobody is really specific or defines it. So before we even get to context, can we just, for a second, look at what big data is? Because I think a lot of big data is actually lots of little data. Little data being specifically about me and about you and about you, and databases that lump those chunks of little data together and effectively pivot around the individual. And then there's other kinds of big data that's really looking at a particular set of circumstances or bits of data that could possibly be tracked back to a person, but isn't obvious on the surface, right? So there's these, anyway, I made this diagram just out of utter frustration from Tuesday.
If I may add to that, right?
Yeah.
I was about to say, my question, I think we have very clearly articulated what PII means. Right? So I think everybody understands what PII is, more or less. But going back to the definition of big data, and I'm kind of like putting my service provider hat, right? I mean, we have access to so much data, we are clearly not sure, how to treat that data, right? So a definition of what a big data is and what is allowed and what is not allowed, I think is a good exercise.
I don't know how to share my browser.
Well, I can pass you. Are you online?
So in the White House blueprint, we moved away from defining personal information as PII it defined it more broadly as information that could be used
I'm gonna make you
to
presenter.
identify an individual. And
You just shared
that is because of the pre-identification issue and
Well,
the ability to
One person talk,
identify
please.
people, by composite data.
And I'm sorry, just a quick clarification, Mary. So I was able to put the links from chat onto a screen that Cam and I can both see, and I'm looking at a March 31 big data, if unspecific is ridiculous, kind of ASCII thing. Is that right?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, so let's see. Down the left, we've got Mary, Bob, and Sherry, and then those are the rows, and the columns are little data shared in a big data base, big data aggregated, co-created, and then big data personalized. And then what do we learn from looking across these? That's the point you were trying to make, because I might not have gathered your full point.
Okay. So,
We're busy projecting into the room.
sorry,
Hold on.
I apologize.
So there we go. Oh, great. Yeah, we see the projection.
So
Awesome.
sorry.
It's a Mac.
But my point in showing this is that I just want to point out that when we make these grand generalizations about how we should give users better notice and consent, and we should make create some privacy around big data. It's like, well, what big data are we talking about? There's a lot of different kinds of big data. There's the compilation of little data into a giant database. And then there's aggregated and co-created data that is connectable back to the user, maybe, depends on the structure of the data set and all of that. And then there's aggregated from multiple sources. It's really, really depersonalized, but it is still possibly connectable back. And I think we're going to think about solutions, about how to inject privacy into this world. We actually need to distinguish between, and then there's the true little data, except I happen to use, so it's Mary and there's my data, and it's just little data, but I happen to use some cloud or some resource available to me online or in some digital package that still puts the data out there in the world, and it's not completely under my control and in a computer that's disconnected from the internet. So I just want to throw that out there.
No, I think that's a fair point. I think because I'm not sure it changes the nature of big data, but I think it highlights that there are different sets of privacy issues in those different contexts. So if you're dealing with something that is depersonalized or anonymized, that's a different order of risk from something that links the same data with PII, which clearly and easily identify an individual. I think from the standpoint of protecting privacy, it's important for people handling the anonymized data to be conscious of the risk of re-identification, and not to rely simply on the anonymization as solving the privacy problems. But I think from the identity standpoint, the focus for your work really is on data that is connected with PII. So how do you create an ecology that of trusted identity around that PII?
I think I could highlight another overlap too between this insight that you highlighted in terms of these contextual buckets and how they raise different issues, and the mission of NSTIC, which is the FIPS as reflected in the strategy NSTIC document, and as reflected in Consumer Bill of Rights and the EU privacy directives. All of them include this concept that individuals would have a right to be informed of the data about, the personal data about them and the right to gain access, greater or lesser, but there's some that's always a part of FIPS. So that is fundamentally assuming an identity service, an identity capability, shall I say, that allows for a connection between the person asking, can I have data about me, and the organization, probably, that has the data about them. Well, so they're logging in, ultimately, somehow. They're sending an email that's affiliated with them. They have a username and password and a Gmail or a corporate or some account that is connected to the identified person about whom there is data that has been personally identified. We don't have that right now. There's no such capability. NSTIC is supposed to result in, our group is supposed to result in an ecology of identity services that would be trusted, and perhaps one of the outcomes could be when we do our job in NSTIC and we have that ecology, now there would be a capability, a mechanism by which people could, in each one of these layers, Mary, potentially be informed or have notice that there is personally identifiable data that is commingled in this sort of co-created, aggregated database. They could, in theory. If there's no possibility without identity, you wouldn't know who to give notice, and a person wouldn't even know how to ask, and you wouldn't know if you're giving it to the right person, because when you're giving
exactly. And I think that right of access, really needs to be limited to sensitive information and where the subject is identifiable.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're gonna end up requiring re-identification.
Right.
And
ironic.
That's obviously.
So guys, we've got a couple people on the phone line that want to ask questions. David.
Thanks, David.
Was that a call out to me, Dave Weitzel?
It certainly was.
Okay. Is anybody on this call from the Privacy Committee?
Yeah, David Bruggeman here.
We sound relatively underinformed given the good work we've done for the last year, moving beyond FIPS to a broader view of privacy through the hard work of a very large team, and I think we need to bring that to bear into this conversation.
Yeah, can you do that, or can you call on somebody that could?
I have only been working through, deferring to my colleague Stuart Shapiro. So I'd rather have somebody from the committee who's watched the, all of the blocking and tackling of what the committee's done, rather than my dilettante review.
Well, there might be something to productive to come from taking a big data test case and working it through our privacy evaluation methodology.
I believe that would be true.
I mean, that's the most immediate suggestion to come to mind.
Well, can we make a follow-up agenda item on the Privacy Committee, and I can volunteer, if we schedule it well, especially once I'm back to civilian regular member status and not in my vice chairly role, and I'd be happy to come by and start with that item. And specifically, one of the things Cam's been helping lead here at MIT that's very relevant is we have the MIT Big Data Privacy Working Group, which has got it's got some really nice participation from industry and from a wide variety of folks. And we've got a number of scenarios that we've been working up within that work group to help people get their mind around the privacy issues. I would probably start by checking with Danny Weitzner and Cam and others, but if there are some of those scenarios that would be especially appropriate to then kick over to IDESG, so that you'd be starting with an input of a scenario, or maybe a choice of scenarios that are already in a sense pre-vetted as being juicy big data scenarios that raise issues and that may have a solid privacy overlap. And then we can inform back to this privacy initiative and then the broader conversation through Danny and Cam what your tool is, and maybe it would be of even broader use potentially once we put it through its phases than the uses that we had intended within the IDESG.
Well, the thing I would say, Daza, is it's certainly useful to start with the FIPS, but if you end with the FIPS you're not paying attention to where the privacy debate has moved to among the academics and the scholars, including people near you, right? So Danny is connected, is into that as anybody else.
Yeah.
But, right, I mean, if you're not tracking what's going on through Dan Solov's taxonomy view of this, or Helen Nissenbaum's views, you know, there's more than that's gone on from the classic 1973 or 1980 view of FIPS among privacy professionals. And I think that needs to be brought to bear on something this big.
Thank you. That's really helpful. For what it's worth, the reason I mentioned FIPS is because even with Helen's analysis and the other, I think with the new analyses that I'm familiar with, it doesn't go away. I think some of it's applied and it's transcended, and it's also just something I feel solid about. So that's partly why I was using it as an anchor. It's also part of the, and it's almost like the constitution of NSTIC. But you're right. It shouldn't be limited, and I didn't mean to state it as a limiting factor.
And then the other thing I wanted to say, Daza, is, you know, from a scale and volatility side, you know, we certainly have to understand that we're talking about potentially orders of magnitudes of more volume of data in this space, and really sort of, you know, a full-blown Internet of Things view of it needs to be brought to bear.
No, that's absolutely right.
Internet of Things, yeah. So, yeah, because part of what, I hate to keep bringing it back to NSTIC, but in NSTIC, it's, and actually in our rules of association, we have in the charter identity of people, but also there's a hook for identity of organizations, which has been not treated very much yet, but also it doesn't even stop there. They have, what is it, like devices code? They actually talk about non-organization and non-human entities, like, you know, the server, the phone, the important infrastructural code base. And so I think Internet of Things is very much in the ambit of what IDESG is supposed to look at, and it's got to be one component of the solution. Also the value.
Yeah, that's I mean, all those remotely remote devices.
Yeah, all of them.
And then just to wrap up, Daza, is, you know, even beyond that, we need to really look at not only physical me, right, but we need to look at the cyber side, plus we need to look at the cyber physical, because, you know, those Internet of Things devices have influence back on us. So is my car a thing, you know, that what's the PII relationship between me and my car? It's a very different thing than one would have thought back in 1973 or 1980.
Yep.
Because with all onboard systems and customization and personalization and the telemetry that gets drawn off of you're saying it like becomes potentially a chameleon extension of your identity potentially?
It's wirelessly connected potentially up to, you know, 200 getting smarter devices that are in real contact with other things, potentially even including the road.
It's like your phone.
Right, it tattles on me in real time.
That's a tracking device and all kinds of other things.
That's something. That's very. So I can't wait to go through the analysis from the Privacy Committee and see how it addresses some of these boundary issues about, you know, the extent where our identity starts and ends and what's included. You know, just to add to that, David, and for those on the phone, I think the question that my mind goes to is not directly to the hardware extensions, the smartphone and the car, for example, that become, I don't know, penumbras of our identity, but actually, like, this notion of our identity also exists as a kind of software, a statistically modeled software that results in scores and ratings of various types, probabilistic models by which, you know, recommender engines suggest what we might be interested in, and by which also we may be identified as a person that would maybe fall in a certain category for purposes of an offer or public policy or law enforcement, you know, up and down the spectrum. There's this other dimension of our identity beyond a small handful of attributes like the name and email address and the PII list, and it goes to this almost algorithmic dynamic, data-driven entity that hasn't got really a good single name right yet, but it exists, and it's a large part of, I think, where our identity is becoming comprised of and where it's headed. So I think that might be part of it. The extension, too.
Yeah, it's your data shadow. Actually, I'm going to direct this question to Colin Wallace. It's Andrew again. So in the, just a slight slant on the identity impacts on big data. In identity proofing and verification standards, a couple of the things that are tested are liveness, right, and presence in the community. So how can we harness big data to prove that we exist in the community? So what tools might there be so that we could associate ourselves with our data shadow when we need to say it is actually me? And the reason I'm asking Colin is because New Zealand originated a whole bunch of stuff. We keep forgetting to call out.
Yeah, well, that's a hell of a question, because we originated it before.
We have high expectations.
The notion of the Internet of Things.
Yeah, we have high expectations of the answer.
I can't, to be honest. To say it's a conversation that's actually more going on in other places than in New Zealand right now. We've kind of we're looking at what the identity of things discussion in Kantara. We're looking at and actively editing one of the co-editors of ISO 29003, identity proofing and verification of individuals, organisations, devices and software. So we are co-editing there. We're learning as much as contributing. In fact, we're learning much more than contributing.
Yeah.
I guess my sense is that our current view of the space is that the policy, while the policy needs to be formed, a bit worried about the policy formed without any kind of, in a technical vacuum.
Right.
And if you've got to have some sort of kind of end state in mind, and our sense is that involves a whole lot around consent and, personal data, personal cloud, personal data ecosystems, consent and privacy managed dashboards and that sort of stuff. Tagging, meta tagging of data such that it can be that an algorithm can skip over it if that's what the tag is basically saying it is doing, or including, depending on what the consent, the metadata of the consent that's then also tagged to that piece of data is saying about when that data can be used and when it can't be. So those are the things that we're sort of kind of thinking about at the moment. Horrible answer, but.
And Mary?
So I actually think there's a really easy analogy to whether or not, so the question is, can there be a trust mark for a service that does not contribute to big data in any way? So I think the word trust mark is actually not quite correct, and so I'm going to substitute assurance mark or markup. Okay. So if it's really about assurance, well, what gives assurance right now that doesn't contribute to big data in any way in our analog lives? Well, I have a driver's license. The state of California gave it to me. They assure my street address at one point in time when they mail me that license. I could move, and they don't actually ask me to do anything other than update it on their website. But my license assures that I, at least at one point in time, have the right to drive and I have a particular address. And at some point they took my photo and maybe there's some physical demarcations about me that they have mildly assured when I went through the line, depending on how much the DMV person was paying attention. So it's, I mean, that's an assurance mark, and it doesn't necessarily contribute to big data. Now, we know that the state of California DMV is participating in some online stuff now, but if I want to show that assurance mark to somebody in order to be able to maybe buy alcohol or drive my car and then I'm pulled over, or for whatever, as identity for making a purchase in a store, I do that now. I'm sure that there are digital versions of exactly that kind of thing that we could come up with that would be assurance marks for a service that doesn't contribute to big data, but that could in a direct transaction, assure that some aspect about me is correct?
I just want to add, this is Sitarama, we need to see, again, going back to the question of how do we define big data, right? So is big data within the realm of one enterprise, one entity, or is it across entities? Because if we are talking about big data that is within one entity, it's kind of off limits in the sense that, our businesses are not going to be entertaining policies that are going to define what they can do with their data inside their boundaries, inside their walls.
Well, yes and no.
Right? But if we are talking about policies that are used to, transmit the data between entities, maybe that is something that we can kind of include in the mark, whatever mark.
I don't agree with that premise.
Yeah, David, can you just extrapolate on that a bit?
Right.
And then
I got data sets that I work with government agencies that cannot leave certain areas even within an entity. No question about it. Federal law would be breached if they did. Think of asylee information at Citizen and Immigration Service. Highly protected. National law is protecting it. People get fired if they violate it. International embarrassment if it would happen.
Okay, well, David, let's pull up a level for a moment. And the purpose of the Birds of a Feather session was so that people could say things, including things that are, wrong. Like I'm sure I've said many already, because it's a new area, and so we want to learn and then assert things and see what sticks, right? But I think it is useful.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be insulting there. I meant to say I think we need to refine the discussion a bit to say that there are certain entities that just can't pass data back and forth, and I think the same thing might exist for healthcare institutions and others.
Yeah, just so, and I apologize, I didn't mean to imply that you were insulting David, because I didn't mean that. I guess what I was getting at is that I guess the question is sort of in what way is it relevant that there may be, like a rejection of the premise of regulating the use of big data within an entity. And, while it's true that there are regulations and legal regimes and some other times when there may be obligations within an entity to have reporting and other, do it this way, don't do it that way kind of rules for big data, Fair Credit Reporting Act, HIPAA, on down the line, within a single entity, there can be all sorts of requirements. I think what's really interesting about the insight of the gentleman is that as we look at new rules and how to bridge the gap with big data and what kind of expectations will be needed, there's a real sensitivity to rules that would govern, new rules that don't exist now that would govern big data use within a single institution. That's just, doesn't go without saying, especially in an American context. It's a particular political and social playing field here, and it's part of our equation as we try to think through what are the issues and how do we best address them. I wanted to just make one other quick insight here, which is when you're talking about, Mary, you were talking about trust marks a moment ago and how that could be very useful. And then what you postulated was, for example, if the trust mark indicated that the organization, I think it was something along the lines of, wasn't contributing to the big data about you that you maybe didn't know, but could give a particular answer to something like, are you over 18? I just want to leave you with the thought that, I believe it would be worthwhile to apply that same thinking about how could a trust mark be valuable, but then to be very flexible and say, how could it be valuable to a number of different scenarios, the one you said, Mary said, but also there's any number of other scenarios as well where trust mark could be very helpful. For example, if there was an organization that volunteered to provide people with access to the personal data or personal data about them that's derived from big data analytics, for example, and that's what the trust mark meant. That could be incredible. And then there's other things trust marks could mean. NSEC has in the mission to come up with trust marks and accredit organizations that bring about trusted identities in cyberspace. So this is one of the tools that we're supposed to explore, and it's a very fertile territory. So I guess before we close it out, I want to ask Cam, did you have any kind of thoughts or any maybe? Nothing? No? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I've
offered them.
Yeah, and folks in the room there, as you were out, is there anything in closing that someone's about to burst an appendix there, Andrew, that's been trying to talk? Or are we good?
I think we're good.
No, I think that's about it.
Can I say two more words? One is...
I can't read the room, but if it looks okay in the room, it's okay by us.
10 seconds. Think about compliance and what it looks like, and think about what granularity you want for data tagging.
Great. Yeah, one of the things that Cam and I both kind of raised our eyebrows in terms of follow-up that's interesting was Colin's statement about the innovative way they were talking about tagging. And so the second point, David's very well taken here. And the first one as well on compliance. So thanks for that. And so, thanks for everyone for coming to the Birds of a Feather session. I suppose we should write some notes up, I can do that, and I'd ask anyone that took notes or that can get the chat to please share them as well. And as a follow-up, there'll be at least one agenda item on the Privacy Committee call where I'll bring a scenario from our work group to see if we can work it through with the tool. And I think that's it. So with that, I thank you all again very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you probably just by chat, mostly, for the rest of the plenary. And thanks again. And,
thanks for joining you.
Thank you, Dazo.
Thank you.
For wrapping up here.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Sudi. Bye, all.